Welcome to the ICA. I am Rosalie Dobell, the Associate Curator of Talks. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first in a series of 4 Lunch Bytes talks, which we're hosting. These have been organised by Curator Melanie Buhler, who I will pass over to you very quickly, because we have lots to get through today. I just wanted to express my thanks to our partners who we've worked on with this, is the Goethe Institute, Arcadia Missa and Goldsmiths. A quick note, we will have a panel discussion and then our speakers and chair will take questions. We have roving mics, so please do wait for those. And I shall now pass over to Melanie to introduce our speakers.
Hi, welcome. My name is Melanie Buhler and I'm the curator of the Lunch Bytes series. Lunch Bytes started in 2011 when the Goethe Institute in Washington, D.C. asked me to come up with a program at lunchtime which would deal with the internet and its cultural implications. In response, I came up with the concept of Lunch Bytes, a series of discussions dedicated to art and digital culture. I don't know, can you hear me all well? Okay. The concept of the program is to pick a topic with relevance to digital culture and to bring together 2 artists and 2 experts from different fields, such as curators, academics, scholars, intellectuals, etc., to present their work in relation to the topic of the talk and to engage in a discussion. With the Goethe Institute in Washington, D.C. and the Hirscher Museum and Sculpture Garden, who joined the project as a partner, we organized an extensive series in Washington, D.C. in 2011 and 2012. Invited speakers included speakers such as Lauren Cornell, curator of the New Museum and then director of Rhizome, the German net artist Cornelia Solfrank, the Whitney curator Christiane Paul, Peter Weibel from the ZKM in Karlsruhe, and so forth. We also organized 2 evening events, which included lectures, artist presentations, performances, and live music, featuring contributions by artists and musicians such as Oneohtrix Point Never, James Ferraro, and Claire Evans. In 2012 and 2013, I was also invited to organize 2 talks at Art Basel Miami, and Art Basel in Basel. Lunch Bytes continues this year as a European project launched by the Goethe Institute in the region Northwestern Europe. Throughout 2014, events will take place in Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Dublin, Glasgow, Helsinki, London, and Stockholm, with the following partners institutions as you see them listed on the slide. All of these events are dedicated to 4 major themes: medium, structures and textures, society, and life. The project will then culminate with a symposium in Berlin in 2015. The discussions are always closely organized in close collaboration with local partners. Here in London, it's a great pleasure to work with Arcadia Missa, the digital culture unit of Goldsmiths College, University of London, as well as the ICA. This event today is the 3rd Lunch Bytes event of the European series. As part of the first event series on the theme medium, we will today discuss the status of the medium as a conceptual entity in the age of digitization. How has the meaning of this concept changed, and how useful is it when considering contemporary artistic practice? The speakers on today's panels are, and I'm announcing them in the order in which they speak, Inke Arns, Hugh Lemmy, Hito Steil, and Harry Sanderson. Each of them will give a short presentation before engaging in the panel discussion. But now let me first briefly introduce the speakers. Inke Arns is a curator and the artistic director of Hardware Medienkunstverein, a platform for the production, presentation, and communication of contemporary and experimental media art in Dortmund, Germany. She has worked internationally as an independent curator, writer, and theorist specializing in media art, net cultures, and Eastern Europe. Yulemi is an artist and writer based in London. He writes on digital culture, sexuality, and politics for Rhizome, The New Inquiry, and The White Review, amongst others, as well as fictions and plays. He is co-director of Limazulu Project Space. Then Harry Sanderson, sitting on the very side. Harry Sanderson is a London-based artist. His practice ranges from sound performances to interactive software sculptures, video work, and online commissions. His work has been exhibited at Space London, Nadine Brussels, and Arcadia Missa London. And then Heather Style. Heather Style is a filmmaker, video artist, and writer. In addition to various exhibitions, her work was shown in the Venice Biennial and the Istanbul Biennial in 2013, the Taipei Biennial in 2010, Documenta 12 in Kassel, and Manifesta 5. She is a professor of art and multimedia at the University of Arts in Berlin. The discussion will be chaired by Matthew Fuller, professor of cultural studies and director of creative programs at the Digital Culture Unit of the Centre for Cultural Studies, Goldsmith, University of London. Before we start, I would like to thank the people involved in organizing and conceptualizing this discussion. Eva Schmidt, head of the cultural department of the Goethe Institute in London, Mario Schruff, project coordinator at the Goethe Institute in London, Tom Clarks and Roja Farkas, director of Arcadia Missa, Matthew Fuller, who will also be chairing the discussion, and of course, Rosalie Dubel, the curator of talks and events at the ICA. Many thanks also to the panelists for coming and to you for coming out today. And now I would like to hand over to Inke Arns, our first presenter.
Okay, thanks a lot, Melanie. It would be great if you would do the slides for me. So, thank you. Thanks to Bytes for inviting me to participate in this panel here at the ICA. And also thanks to the Goethe Institute for being extremely supportive for bringing me. As we will be discussing formats and media on this panel, I take the opportunity to talk about net art and something called post-internet art. Sometimes post-internet is also linked to post-media or post-digital. These two practices seem to be related because of the media of net art and post-internet. But as I hope to show you within 10 minutes, they don't really relate to each other. I would even claim that they are radically opposed to each other. In preparing for this panel, I was told that the audience would be very diverse. So I will try to make my position as clear and accessible as possible. I'm starting with some examples. In total, you will see like 4 artistic positions, as I had to limit myself. So I'm here, for example, starting with a piece of classical net art by Heath Bunting. I will also show you pieces by recent pieces by Olja Lialina, Cornelia Solfrank, so pioneers of so-called net art of the mid-1990s, and then I will show you very few examples of so-called post-internet. Katja Nowitzkova is a very good example, I think. So let's look at this project here, Heath Bunting's Read Me, Own, Be Owned, or Remain Invisible. It was created in 1998. 89 would be interesting as well. 1998, which is 16 years ago. And it has become one of the best known and most frequently cited works of net art, I would say. And now it's one of the classics in the genre. It consists of a text about bunting published in the UK edition of Wired. The individual words, yeah, it's kind of visible. The individual words used by the author, James Flint, all represent hyperlinks to the internet addresses of companies. At that time, we said we were calling them .coms, operating under the same name. In 1998, so in the year when this project was created, this was a horror vision, made more explicit by the work's subtitle, which is "Own, Be Owned, or Remain Invisible." While in 1998 many of the links led nowhere, today all the links, however absurd they might seem, lead to existing companies' websites. It's obvious that with this project, Heath Bunting was critically addressing the rapid privatization of the public domain in the late 1990s. In terms of format, I think it would be interesting to conceive of this project as time-based or even a kind of durational performance. But we can discuss this later. My second example, could you show the second slide? Is Olja Lialina's piece. It's a very recent one, created in 2013. It's a short animated loop, and perhaps you can go to the next slide. I don't know if you can start the video. If not, I will start it for you. So it's a very bad video, which I recorded yesterday or the day before yesterday. It's a short animated loop of the artists swinging on a playground swing that is seemingly fixed to the top of the browser window. It's not running. Okay. Also, okay. Or we can repeat it several times. So it's a short animated loop of the artist swinging on a playground swing that is seemingly fixed to the top of the browser window. When you load the animation, it plays back quite jerkily. This lack of smooth movement is part of the piece. As you can see in the video, if you look at the location bar, each frame of the animation is played back from a different website. The browser is redirected from one server to the next, the speed and smoothness of the animation dependent on the functioning of the internet infrastructure that supports it. There are 21 frames in the piece, distributed across 21 different websites. As Lialina told the online magazine Hyperallergic, I'm quoting her briefly, "I like to swing," that's a quotation by Olja, "I like to swing on the location bar of the browser, and I like to know that the speed of swinging depends on the connection speed, and that you can't watch this GIF offline." My last example from the field of net art, and show the next slide, is Cornelia Solfrank's Anonymous Warhol Flowers. This is a version created in 2008, as it was realized in the exhibition Anna Kournikova, Art in the Age of Intellectual Property, which we did in 2008 in Dortmund. So in 1997, Cornelia Solfrank released the net art generator. Upon entering a search term, like for example, Andy Warhol flowers, a computer program collects images from the internet and then reassembles them to create new artworks with this digital material. Though this artistic practice is well established in an analog context as collage, its application in a digital context gives rise to legal questions concerning the handling of digital material from the internet. Who and where is the author of this performative copyright infringement? Is it A, the software, or B, the programmer of the Perl script, or C, the user entering the search term, or D, the original author, the so-called original author, whose material is being taken from the net? And here it's completely unclear whether it's Andy Warhol himself or Patricia Caulfield, whose images he is using. Or even E, the artist who conceptualized the entire thing. So in terms of format, all of these works are rather unstable. They are never fixed. They develop over time, like Bunting's piece, or they happen in between servers, like Lialina's piece. Or finally, they are products of generative processes, like Solfrang's piece. The artists never intended to produce commodities or sell artworks. Much of early net art, as well as software art, is questioning what could be called the 4 Cs underlying the digital surfaces. And the 4 Cs would be control, copyright, code, and communication. And of course, there are many other examples from the period of early net art. Webstalker would be one example, or the work of Übermorgen. So the next 2 slides, it's my last 2 slides. So first we have this one. I'm now giving you some examples from the context of so-called post-internet. I'm just focusing on the work of Katja Nowitzkova. But of course, there's a lot of other different artists who work also with different media, but let me try to focus on this one. Now, if we look at so-called post-internet or post-digital art, and if we compare it to early net art, we can see a very interesting shift in perspective. What do uber-hip terms like post-internet mean? First of all, we can say that the term post-internet is used by a pretty well-defined group of young, mainly post-1980s artists, many of them Americans living in between Berlin and New York. Their definition of post-internet goes like this. We as digital natives grew up in a world where digital media and the internet are everywhere, and it is our natural habitat which we do not need to address specifically anymore. We use the visual culture of this habitat and make art out of it. So can you possibly switch to the next slide? So what Katja Nowitzkova is doing, she's actually using images, anonymous images from the internet. Here, a kind of gymnastics dancer or a bird, or you saw other animals. She's blowing them up in a gigantic, to a gigantic size, and then putting them as sculptures in the exhibition space. So, to quote the artists again, we use the visual culture of this habitat and make art out of it. Perfectly valid. Pop art has been doing it, and other practices as well. Think about found footage and ready-made, all of them using existing, mainly anonymous materials, for example, a bottle dryer, and turning them into art. However, I think that post-internet is a rather misleading, or better, a blurry term. I would rather call it the new sculpture. Why? Because much of this art practice is about taking visual objects from the internet and translating them into material objects in an exhibition space. At least this is the approach one could see recently in the exhibition Speculations on Anonymous Materials in Kassel in Germany at the Fridericianum. Like its predecessor pop art, the new sculpture, as I'm calling it, is interested in the surfaces of consumer culture. Only this time it is the uncanny surfaces of digital consumer culture. What this interest in the surfaces and the digital bling-bling, however, is missing is a critical questioning of those 4 Cs I mentioned earlier underlying these surfaces. So control, copyright, code, and commodification. All of these issues have not simply gone away, but rather I would claim these Cs have become even more important with increasing digitization of our everyday life. Don't get me wrong, celebrating or embracing the uncanniness of digital surfaces or material is perfectly valid. However, this disinterest in the political nature of technical infrastructure and the effacing or erasing or making invisible of the computer underneath, which is responsible for the crisp surfaces, clearly distinguishes the new sculpture from earlier forms of so-called net art. What's more, post-internet artists who, for example, make use of the pervasive culture of lol cats images, a kind of digital folklore, might take these images for face value, namely as funny images of funny cats. They might not be aware that, especially in forums like 4chan, these images were being used by Anonymous as steganographic containers for messages of a very different kind. Another crucial difference to net art is the fact that post-internet was, from its very beginning, conceived as a potential commodity. It is no wonder that there are workshops now about post-internet for art collectors being organized in the context of art fairs. This recently happened at Art Rotterdam, and Melanie and myself, we went to this workshop. Very interesting. In contrast to this, early net art tried very hard to avoid anything that would make it even resemble a commodity. And I'm coming to a conclusion, because I think my 10 minutes are over. To conclude, let me address some topics of this panel more in depth, and I hope to also open this up towards a discussion we will have. When discussing contemporary art, I think it still makes sense to think in terms of format. Is it sculpture? I mean, really basic formats, right? Is it sculpture? That means, is it a spatial object, even if it is in virtual space? Or is it an image? For example, a painting, a photo, a digital print, or a drawing. Is it a time-based piece? Is it film, performance, interactive? Or is it a text, written or spoken? I think these categories make perfect sense, and I think they're not changed by digital. The digital. I don't necessarily distinguish whether a piece is digital or not. And as a footnote, of course, as a curator, I have to know what I'm going to exhibit. So, of course, I'm interested in what pieces consist of. I think it is crucial to reflect on materials used by artists and how these materials are massively being informed and altered by digital technologies. This is what made the exhibition Speculations on Anonymous Materials interesting, in spite of my criticism of the post-internet approach. It showed how, in the age of pervasive computing, the state of any contemporary material or matter is changing. Post-digital in this context addresses the omnipresence of the digital and not its disappearance. The digital is exhumed from its everyday objects, revealing itself as always already present. That was a quotation by Kerstin Starkemeyer from Texte zur Kunst, who wrote a really interesting review of the show. Today we could even say that it is matter itself that has become an immaterial. The notion of immaterials actually was coined by Jean-François Lyotard in 1985 with his exhibition Les Immatériaux at the Centre Pompidou in Paris. According to Lyotard, an immaterial is not something opposite of matter, but denotes new qualities and extensions of material. And I'm just giving you a very short quote from that text, from the press release of the show actually, from 1985. The good old matter itself comes to us in the end as something which has been dissolved and reconstructed into complex formulas. Reality consists of elements organized by structural rules, matrices, that exclude the possibility of direct human access. At first sight, these immaterials are indistinguishable from the materials we know of old. However, they are organized according to wholly different laws. It is this growing uncanniness of our contemporary surroundings that post-internet addresses quite well, I think. However, what this approach fails to look at is the technological structure of our digital things. Contemplating the high-definition surface, it does not give us the tools to address these gray or evil media, as Matthew Fuller has coined the term. So it does not allow us to address these gray or evil media in a critical way and to potentially conceive of alternatives. Thank you.
I think maybe I'll address some of those points actually in what I'm going to talk about with regards to infrastructure. I want to talk about sociality as a medium within digital art production and some of the ethical implications and issues that surround that with regards to the institution. I think this can best be summed up really with the hashtag #NoDads. #NoDads is a hashtag that's attached to sort of examples of old hierarchical institutions attempting to come to terms with new networks and the effect of new networks, and then also to do with the way that those institutions then appropriate and try and contextualize these new networks within their older hierarchical forms. So what do we mean when we talk about sociality as a medium? Well, it's a move towards understanding relationships not as a reaction to work, but as actually a formal property within the artwork. Obviously, it's nothing new, but it's that the change has perhaps been sped up or engendered differently within social media, social networks, and within post-internet art. I think perhaps part of I think the move towards using sociality medium is part of a neoliberal process, but it's also part of a sort of an older process which is coming to terms with a collapse of a social democratic conception of social relations, and this like micro-utopianism that comes through it as well. So, I mean, obviously we saw this going right back to Gordon Matta Clark in some ways, but also obviously within relational aesthetics. So, but I think I'd want to distinguish between relational work and sociality as a medium within artwork. What distinguishes this, in my mind, is the predetermination of any given situation. I think relational aesthetics has provides a set of parameters within which relationships are set to occur within a gallery space or an institutional space, whereas sociality, or using the social as a medium, is about seeing that there's a vast potential of a network that already exists. And it tries to harvest or manipulate that network within the institution. So the network, it pre-exists, and it's reflected within the artwork as material property rather than being something that is produced as a relation of the artwork. The internet's produced obviously a very new relationship between the institution, the artist, and the audience. Anyway, I think works that focus on sociality as a medium, which in this term we're going to bracket broadly under sort of the rubric of post-internet, explore developing networks of knowledge and affect and creativity through mimicry and through creative and critical reworking of already existing social networks. Visibility here being the sort of the key vector of that without the already existing social networks, there is no sociality to take advantage of. I think there's been a trend then within post-internet work towards building digital platforms which utilise and rework those those interpersonal connections, both online and away from the keyboard, as well as the stuff that's made as a result of those networks, which it repackages as sort of artistic content. So I'm trying to think of a good example of this is, say, the work of people like Ed Forney-Ellis or Lucky PDF, where they build digital platforms which they then fit within a network that already exists of artistic producers, and they use the work that is being made by not just artistic producers but a public who previously might have been seen as an audience as the actual content of their work. Just as the visual image has now come to sort of compete within an avalanche of digital visual images. So the social now has to compete as a medium within an already existing avalanche of social networks, and that are already thriving despite the role of the artist. So I think there's been an inversion of the role of the artist as the person who creates these relationships. So I don't really want to sort of assess necessarily the successes and failures and difficulties of using sociality per se, but I really want to look at the way that the wider institutional issues, the way that institutions are implicated within the process, and the way that institutions are really failing the networks that are challenging them by going for the easy option of people who appropriate the networks in an exploitative way. I think institutions have been confused and scared by an explosion of both online creativity and the platforms that have evolved for image making and sharing. I think it's a challenge to the role of the institution and the artist as a person who contextualizes and canonizes images. And they're starting to realise that these new forms of network production that are being constructed around them are actually game changers in that way. It's a major shift in the way that people understand image making in itself. It's perceived as both a threat to their role as a tastemaker, as a market regulator, but also they see it as an opportunity to access a huge wealth of cheap content, and learning how to harness the power of networks and network production without being overtaken by it, or is really the number one question for institutions when they're trying to deal with post-internet work. There's what you might term a digital lack within institutions, which is a lack of understanding of how democratized image production and dissemination in new social forms are emerging, but there's also an understanding that they lack a way to address these issues themselves. So post-internet art is a term that has neatly packaged a lot of these questions that are obviously being asked all across society in politics and economics, in sort of democratic decision making, and there's a nice term there that they can now hook onto, and neatly packaged. It's seen as the answer to this problem of a digital lack. It's enabled by the internet and by digital technology, but it can also be made to look like it is somehow representative of it, or an analog of those networks that are emerging. So what are the ethical implications of that, and how does it fit into larger issues of how value is being created by sociality? It seems clear to me that within the social economy of the internet, there is already a very different ideology of power to some of the hierarchical forms of institutionalization. And it's got a libertarian bias against the idea of both institutional power and of fixed influence. It's kind of a clash of operating systems between the network and the institution. They're slow to manoeuvre. They don't really understand what's happening. It's not native or natural to where they operate, and so it's, essentially, I think what you've got is an institution which thinks that it sees these networks operating underneath them, producing all these new forms of art, and it doesn't see themselves as a node within that network. They see themselves as operating on a different level, where they can bestow credibility and resources onto it, and they don't actually recognise that they are actually operating as a very powerful node within that network, and because they don't understand that's not a natural way for them to work, they're actually becoming a clumsy node, and they're bestowing their vast digital assets and the power of visibility in a very clumsy way. And I think they're doing that because they're trying to maintain a certain degree of control by refusing to acknowledge their own position of bias within the network. They go into a defensive manoeuvre where they hook into anything that they can give them credibility within the network. In doing so, they're not necessarily looking for the most interesting or challenging aspects of the network, but the one that could be most easily packaged within their curatorial their existing curatorial regime. So one of the repercussions of this is that the need for the institution to maintain a facade of neutrality, because it thinks that the model of the institution is to legitimise the artist based upon its curatorial authority. But if within that network it doesn't actually have any curatorial authority, that's when it becomes this clumsy node. So I think this is what I mean by this hashtag #NodeAds, which is it's got a patriarchal role within that network of bestowing power and resources and visibility, which are key and crucial things to within the network to have influence. But it's doing it in an attempt to dominate that network in the worst examples of it. So I think we're seeing with a bonfire of the institutions across the world, across disciplines, not just within the arts, but within the digitization is changing people's relationships with governments and with media in general. And the development of a online digital culture is really destroying the specialization of the artist as the role of the producer of meaning and the producer of images, and also it's destroying the institution as a historicising and canon-producing agent within that as well. So what we're seeing is the artistic equivalent of the Napster moment, the Napster moment being a point when a system of distribution is completely shattered by technological developments which render its that system, the hegemonic role of that system, obsolete. Napster being the file sharing site which really challenged the understanding of copyright and within music industry. But we're also seeing something like a WikiLeaks moment, which is the moment the ideological framework that justifies power that's held in the institutions is shattered by technological developments and by accessibility to a voice and to be able to speak about these things. I think that the platforms that are offered by digital production and the prevalence of sociality as a medium have stripped away the ideological justification for a lot of art institutions as arbiters of power, and the innovation that's happening for a network is actually a lot more than is happening for the institutions.
It seems to me as if the two previous speakers have sort of circled around the moment of a decisive break or almost a sea change in the production, but also in our understanding of what art production could be from very different perspectives. And I'm just going to try to add a different perspective, a perspective born from practice, actually. What does it mean to work with digital media, and what are the quite urgent and dramatic changes only within the last years with respect to that? So let me boil this down to one really, really simplistic formula. I think that, previously people used to think of media as something that was in a way in between people. No, that was in the middle. That was some media were tools that people could use, or to make something, to produce something, to communicate, whatever. But they were sort of somehow located in between as intermediaries, if you like. But I think the real shift now is that, people still use media, but media use people. And I think this is a really interesting shift in the way that media or images or in all sorts of platforms of information are scanning people, are mining people for forms of relationality, for information, patterns of behavior, and so on and so on. So the users are being used. And this is one situation which has by now become, absolutely obvious, but which requires a lot of new skills, basically for everyone, that has anything to do with media, to be able to navigate it and to deal with this new kind of challenges. And I think that there is a major spatial angle to this development too, and this may refer to some of which some things that the previous speakers have mentioned, which is in a way for me the shift from a network space that is contained somehow, not really locked behind screens, but somehow networks were contained, whereas I have the feeling that now they have started leaking into, not only started, but they have already permeated physical so-called 3D reality to a quite extraordinary extent. Something that has been, described already in detail by people like Tiziana Terranova or Keller Easterling in her text, The Internet of Things, how basically access to the network or the nodes of the network became part of urban and architectural infrastructure. And basically people started to be embedded within the networks, almost like packets of, information being relayed through the network rather than, the subjects that were using intermediaries. So, and as I said, this requires a completely new set of skills, which is less being able to use or to produce something with media, but rather to to try to also extricate oneself from being made part of the flow of data, of information, of being sort of drafted into the network almost. So there are new skills needed in trying to organize the flows, in trying to orchestrate, visibility on the one hand, invisibility on the other hand, withdrawal, strike, with respect to the network in which people, not everywhere, not always, in a very uneven way, are being embedded nowadays. And if I may hark back a bit, because I'm basically I was trained as a filmmaker on on equipment that hardly exists anymore, certainly not in use a lot, 16mm cameras and so on and so on. Transitioning to video and then to all sorts of digital media. If I hark back to the history of what I was trained in, a question pops up in my mind which has taken me, which keeps following me around for many years, and this is the question why the famous Soviet film by Dziga Vertov, The Man with the Movie Camera, which was made in the 1920s, became immediately a striking example of the technique of montage, which was very new and experimental at that time. Why was that film not called The Woman at the Editing Desk? No, because in the film you constantly see a male person with a camera running around, capturing life as it really is, as Dziga Vertov kept emphasizing. But this was not the really new point in the film. The point was that its montage, its way of orchestrating, film clips, with articulating them to one another, this was revolutionary. This was completely new. And actually you see the person in the film, which happened to be Vertov's wife, Elizaveta Svilova. You see her, how she's working, how she's doing it. Yet, her role is completely secondary in the film. And the whole attention, the focus of the film is on the heroic, let's say, male worker carrying around the camera, working essentially in what used to be called film production, right? And production was limited in a sort of simple and simplistic understanding of it to the shooting of the film, to the making of the film, to what, people used to see as the factory moment of the film, whereas post-production, which contained editing and syncing and compositing, color correction, all of that, was seen as a sort of supplement, to production. It was not really production, it was secondary. It also was confined very often to indoor spaces, and very often women, especially editors, were doing this kind of labor. So there was a very gendered division of labor, which kept in cinema, in early cinema, the realms of production and post-production separated from one another. But I think that by now, if you look at film production, how film production works, this separation has been toned down, because what used to be called post-production has, in a way, entirely subsumed and sublated, not entirely, but to large parts, production. Meaning that what used to be post, for example, compositing or things that didn't exist before, like modeling, for example. These are replacing the shooting proper of the film more and more, so that production is being more and more integrated and subsumed within post-production. And of course, this has a lot of ramifications also if you think of the implications of what this means, for example, in terms of gender, because post-production was usually not only performed in indoor spaces, in domesticated spaces by female workers, but also in a way very much tied to the idea of reproduction, of reproductive labor. And I think that the realm of reproduction, of course, takes on a whole new range of different meanings in the digital age, in forms of the digital labor that many people are performing nowadays. So I think that all of these activities have now merged, or not merged, but a lot of activities are in a way using the same formats, the same materials, articulate themselves in a similar way within this 4D space I have been mentioning beforehand. And I think that in this realm, in this era, the work with the woman at the editing desk becomes ever more important. She becomes one of the key figures which is able to orchestrate and to navigate such kind of space. And I think that this includes very new areas also of which we weren't, I think most of us at least, many of us weren't aware a few years ago, which is the handling of data, the transformation of data, the encoding of data, the encryption of data, the way to transfer and to transmit data safely, and not only within the network, but across this multiplicity of different materialities, of different carriers, of different, spatial forms of appearance. And for me, one of the prime examples for that, and also to hark back to the beginning of what I said, of the transition of people using media to people being used by media to people who develop the skills to counter being used by media, is the work of Laura Poitras, who started out in a very similar way as I did, as a sort of one-person documentary filmmaker who combined not only being the camera person, of course, but also the editor, but also the producer, who did lots of really, really fantastic documentary films on her own, traveling to places like Iraq and Yemen, and who somehow was forced to acquire a whole new set of different skills after, she started not being the subject behind the camera, but in a way the object of algorithmic surveillance by Homeland Security that basically detained her every time she was trying to cross the border. And this kind of situation of, the media or the power of algorithmic surveillance being turned back upon her, of course, forced her and many of her colleagues to acquire a whole new set of skills which precisely deals with the form that information could take, and the many responsibilities that entails of trying to handle data, information, to transfer them, to encode them, to encrypt them, to pass them on, or to refuse, to pass them on, which are, in my view, very important skills in this new era. Maybe one could also add that many of these skills have, of course, become now very popular, and people are assuming them more and more. I'm just, yesterday I was already sat here and was mentioning the sort of Twitter events associated to the so-called ban of Twitter in Turkey. And of course, scores, millions of people immediately started tunneling out, of Turkish governed internet space using, VPN networks and so on, so that the ban of Twitter essentially ended up with almost the doubling of tweets from Turkey. So the banning resulted in a sort of explosion, not explosion, but in a manifestation of such skills, by people who sort of have have been forced and will be forced more and more from now on to manage and handle such skills. Thank you.
In answering the question of how digital technology relates to my work and to what extent it informs a notion of medium within it, I think it best to begin with a short summary of my views regarding the internal form and structure of these technologies. The internet reduces content to raw data to allow for its transmission. It renders all parts equal in the interest of exchange. When approaching art made from or in relation to digital technology, we are aware that whatever we are looking at has either already existed as or is compelled to be translated into the same raw numerical substance. The reason for this is that the primary function of the internet has been to provide the infrastructure necessary for global capitalism. To find a universal communicative equivalent, in this case data, to which all content could be decomposed and recomposed into on the other side. Exchangeability is the principle to which all forms are reduced. In 1987, Friedrich Kittler noticed that the digitalization of information and channels erases the difference between individual media. Sound and image, voice and text have become mere effects on the surface, the interface for the consumer. Form has been sublimated to the interests of liquidity. Data can be visualized in any number of ways, and thus the particularity of a specific form or realization becomes subject to a radical uncertainty. Why this realization and not another? The effect of this is that adaptable, fluid artworks and ideas become preferable to fixed material ideas, forms, and relations. The medium of the artwork, rather than being its primary form, is transformed into one of many possible instantiations of a similar idea. Artists, aware of the need to remain on point at all times, aim to produce works which open onto as many simultaneous readings and interpretations as possible. The anxiety associated with committing an idea to a final realization is amplified because of an understanding that the artwork must remain compatible with the new structures of exchange and distribution. The perfect artwork is like the perfect worker. The language we use to describe digital technology is bound up in a reification of the connective with the smooth functioning and hygienic ephemerality of exchange, corresponding directly to a revulsion with our physical selves and an alienation from technology itself as a product of human labor. In our fixation with the communicative capacities of technology, we underline precisely the possibilities that it eliminates. This piece is based on eye tracking, which is used to visualize areas of attention in order to study patterns of recognition and optimize the design of websites and adverts. The resulting images are projected onto a screen of water vapor. I find the images this technology produces interesting in that they interpolate the act of looking back into the image. They show us how value pools in certain areas of a given scene, visualizing hierarchies of attention and distraction that are played out across an image, and in doing so break it up into constituent parts. The image is composed of multiple converging fixations, each corresponding to minuscule contractions of muscle tissue. For my piece, I scanned eye movements and then overlaid that data onto images of production, subtracting the parts of the image that didn't draw attention, and thereby distilling the image to its supposedly essential content. The movement that the software surveils is not a fully conscious movement, as the eye moves involuntarily and without complete agency. As such, this technology aligns itself with recent trends in neuroscience that aim to depict human perception in terms intelligible to statistical analysis. To reduce the complex, inherently social nature of human experience to a series of neurological impulses, in turn reducible to raw data, compatible with the logic of the marketplace. Once the image is distilled and concentrated, the interesting thing for me was then to render this as a physical substance or structure. So human vision is converted into a malleable substance, viewable as an independent object. The pixels that make up the image take on an analog form as points in space, rather than as the uniform surface of a screen. In terms of the medium of this piece, it's about exploiting subtle forms of surveillance to give substance to immaterial cognitive processes in a way that underlines our estrangement from them and relates directly to the idea of flexibility and the material of the work as performative of its relation to value and exchange. This piece is a real-time 3D scanner presented as a holographic projection. Viewers could approach the work and be rendered as a 3D object suspended in front of themselves. This is a scan from one of those sessions. I was interested in the idea that the more of yourself you put into something, the less you retain, and the more that self seems to confront you as something alien, how you don't feel yourself, and that selfness is always located somewhere else, mediated through the gaze of others, and increasingly through forms of surveillance, constituted in search bubbles, browsing patterns, targeted ads, etc. The enrichment of one side of a process results in the depletion of its other half. So as the internet extends the reach of networks of communication, we have less to say, or as resolution grows clearer and sharper, we have less idea what it is we're looking at. Labour produces beauty, but for the worker, deformity. This is my most recent show and represents the culmination of research into chains of production behind digital images. The exhibition comprised a selection of work from 6 artists, sound piece, self-built render farm, and constructed from the cheapest possible supplies and left running for the duration of the show. That's not very good, yeah. A single frame of high-resolution imagery can take up to 24 hours to process on a warehouse-scale computer. The discrepancy between energy and labour expended on the one hand and the fraction of a second of fleeting experience on the other is what interested me. Thinking that those contradictions can in turn be smoothed out and integrated into the surface of the finished film or object. The title for the show was taken from a series of advertising campaigns for the data management company Cisco Systems' Unified Data Center. The unified digital fabric depicted in their marketing campaigns as interlocking, flowing meshes, themselves consuming huge amounts of power in their production, is proffered as the outward expression of a corresponding unified social fabric. The new fetish is the flawlessly functioning, metallically brilliant apparatus as such, in which all the cogwheels mesh so perfectly that not the slightest hole remains open for the meaning of the whole. The work I made for the show used an algorithm developed by MIT that can reveal invisible movements in video, such as breathing, blood flow, and pulse. The algorithm goes beyond and interrupts the temporal and spatial unity of the recorded image, adding previously invisible subcutaneous details. I'm interested in the capacity of technology to create and maintain a distance from experience at the same time as it reveals ever more intimate details of our lives and bodies, but also the fact that what is essentially human consistently evades representation. This is the case with this technology, but also with eye tracking or MRI scans, is that what one is actually looking at is as much, if not more so, a production of the technological apparatus used than any truth of the thing it claims to reveal. Instead, it reveals itself, its own representational logic. The crucial gap in the flawlessly functioning apparatus is that it always fails in some way to really show us anything. Okay, I'm going to just talk about this image a little. I think the tendency to reify or to imagine social relations as inherent properties of objects is well illustrated by this image. A man in Kent is seen performing distance healing on a woman with back pain sitting somewhere in California. At first, the image appears as a contradiction, as one assumes there to be a natural incompatibility between the incumbent cosmologies of New Age spiritualism and communications technology. But for a number of reasons, I found this to be far from the case, and in fact the two mindsets actually share a great deal. So my argument is that this process of reification is exactly what we see happening in this image to the communicative capacities of technology, as in the capacity of the internet to just connect people in a functional way is being mistaken for and transformed into something other or spiritual even. I include it here as a way of calling into question the assumption that technology always interacts with culture according purely to logic and rationalism, and that in fact quite the opposite is the case. Thank you.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of material there to go through. We have time. We've got to be out of here at 10 to 4 for a film to take place. So until then, we've got to keep running and talking. One of the questions I have that kind of brings it together, I think I'll just start off with a question before opening to you lot, is about the way in which a lot of the talks brought together questions of system, but also of substance. What is the substance? And how is it systematized, and how does that move out to other forms of systematization? How also does that appear as forms of surface or forms of visibility? How do forms of visibility also interact with forms of systematization? But how also in the present moment, when we're kind of constructed by a remodeling of the institutions, of organizational forms, of computational forms, as forms of command, compliance, and the kind of the integration of computational systems with capital, how also does the surface become the thing in which we're hiding, we're encrypting, we're trying to find ways of not allowing our pulse to become registered on the surface of a screen. I think the video before last had this great example of the way in which eye tracking becomes absolutely integrated, absolutely is a way of integrating value produced through the way capital tracks attention through algorithmic processes of recognition. But we can also say that this is kind of echoed on an institutional form through the questions of networks. The way that networks and institutions recognize circulations of value. So we've had the figure of the museum as the market regulator. So I think there's a number of ways in which the talks kind of spoke to each other about the way in which we're not simply talking about formats. We're also talking about systems. We're talking about surfaces, but also how all of these are interrogated by questions of power. And I just wonder whether all of the talks, in a way, are about the way in which aesthetic practices, in relationship to computational digital media operating through networks, allow a chance for a rearticulation of power through aesthetic practices, but also through the way in which power also is fundamentally reorganized in the present moment, and how artworks perhaps allow a means of contesting that, imaging that, and reorganizing that. And what are the we've had several examples of these. So what are the ways in which that conjugation of computation, aesthetics, and power? What would you take forward from that in order to organize work?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily obvious that there's been a complete redistribution of power, or the power's been changed in any. I think that's one assumption, and it might be true, but it takes a bit more thinking about to say for certain that the impact of networks is egalitarian just because it's decentralizing. I think it's still defined by whether you're included or excluded from it. And I think there's a certain sense in which the internet has effectively connected together lots of people over the world who have quite a good quality of life, and that gives the impression that the effect of the internet is a democratizing one, but it's not necessarily the case at all. Other countries have very different internets to the one we have, and the vast majority of the world has no kind of doesn't have anywhere near the kind of ubiquity of digital commodities that is present here. So there's a big dissymmetry, I think.
Mm. Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely the case. I think the question is really about how, if computational networks, computational systems are recomposing new grammars of power that are absolutely of a different order than even the camera, the editing table, and so on. What are the artistic strategies that operate within, against, reorientate, twist, hack, resurface power, and what are the kind of aesthetic modes in which, as computation and capital, which are the kind of two underlying systems that we're looking at here, in a sense, how they kind of mutually rearticulate each other. What are the kind of ways in which aesthetic strategies create new modes of operation?
Well, I kind of think that if you like the idea with the vapor, it's like quite an obvious literal realization of a value form type thing, you know, flexible, fluid motion. And hopefully you can present those estrangements in a very stark way that brings into focus how estranged you are from, you know, offline experience or, you know, unmediated like social interaction, say, if such a thing were to be possible. So yeah, translating things offline maybe, I think. I don't know.
I think there's a process that networks allow people to do, which is not about necessarily building a counterpower or building a new articulation of a power, but rather opting out. And that's one of the things that the internet has really allowed, is for people not to create a new voice, but to opt out of people speaking for them. As I think that's actually one of the main ways that the internet has allowed people to delegitimize pre-existing institutions, is for people to say, you don't actually speak for me on these issues. I think that a lot of the political changes that we've seen, because of the applications of network technology, are definitely a negative, like a negation of orders of power and not the constructions of new ones. Which is what's quite interesting, is that when these institutions have started to fall apart, there's actually what comes next and what replaces them is not actually something that is built into the technology. What's built into the technology is the removal of legitimacy, not the building of new legitimacy.
Okay, I mean, Inka, I think it's a kind of simplistic, kind of dichotomous question in a sense, between the version of post-internet that you were using and the one that he was using. And there's two takes on the same term, and it's a term that's obviously in circulation. But I wonder how you respond to Hugh's talk.
I definitely would agree with what you said when you talked about you know, how institutions don't behave towards these new systems, you know, how institutions actually don't have any way of, because they don't understand, or they don't want to kind of give up authority, I would say, you know. But something else I wanted to say, I've been thinking about how to formulate this. Of course, there's a lot of you know, artistic projects that go more in the activist direction, that actually reflect on the nature of these systems that are more and more sort of getting closer to all of us, that are these fluid systems that are present everywhere and at any time. So I mean, there would be a lot of examples of artists developing projects that actually make visible what's normally hidden, you know, that I just think about, what's his name again? He had a presentation at Transmediale. He's doing this really great remote telephotography.
Trevor Paglen.
Thank you very much. Trevor Paglen, for example, what he's doing. He's pointing his camera. He's using a camera that's normally used by people who take pictures of the stars, so really objects really far away. And he's actually pointing the objective of his camera onto white spots in the American desert that Google Earth doesn't show, for example. And then he's photographing objects that are 40 kilometers away that, of course, with your bare eyes you don't see. And then suddenly you see appearing, in these photographs, you see either buildings of secret, institutions, or you see when he's pointing his objective at the sky, you see surveillance drones flying. And first of all, the image looks like a beautiful cloud image, very romantic. But then suddenly you realize, also through the title, you realize it's not a photo of a romantic cloud, but it's the photo of a different kind of cloud that's coming with it. Perhaps that could be an interesting example of artists, of an artist who, for me, developed an interesting way of making invisible structures visible, to put it really briefly.
Okay, I think given time, questions from the audience would be great. I think there's a roving mic. Yeah.
Thank you. Also to say thank you to Hito for this exhibition, and really to perhaps push the point which Matthew was making about the relationship between aesthetics and politics. And obviously that must be something that you think about and that your work is engaged in. Wondered if you could say something more about how you think that relationship is operating. Thank you.
Oh, it's these, tiny minor questions.
Yeah.
No, but maybe also to try, because we could name so many great colleagues which are working in the field now. I mean, there are so many of them working from so many different angles at trying to untangle this new form of information capitalism with all its different aspects. But I think maybe the unifying point or perspective is really an old one, which is about giving the form to information, or to reforming or re-informing the form of certain networks and trying to wire them differently or build them differently, or to change their form, to change the directions of the flows within them. There is, sorry to always hark back to the Soviet art history period, but there was this movement in the 20s which was called productivism, when lots of artists started going into factories to try to work on the form of production, right? And to try to improve production processes. It had a lot to do with design, but also with the avant-garde desire of, transgressing from the sphere of art into the one of life. But I think, today similar things are going on, not in the sphere of production, which, as I said, has been sort of subsumed, within a larger realm of circulation. And lots of people are trying, to work on forms of circulation, to change them, to accelerate or interrupt them, or make them visible, or withdraw or make them visible differently. And I think that this is a absolutely crucial task, which is in a way comparable to the previous one, to try to intervene into circulation, or to change it, or also to interrupt it in certain cases. And probably this could be just very tentatively be described as the project, on which so many people are working in so many different ways, from the history of net art, which I think in the inception was very much activist oriented, right? But I think that nowadays, there's no less people trying to work on this kind of issues in a very serious, committed, and also political way.
Okay, there's a question there.
I really like what people said about addressing these structural inequalities in the network. But there's a huge discrepancy. Like this model, it reminded me actually of Emmanuel Costa, the way he talks about the network economy. This very utopistic idea of the network, which has been challenged a lot nowadays, and of course understandably. Like this idea that this network is like each node is equal and decentralized, and they have like equal opportunities and equal frequencies to process information, receive information. But what happens? A bunch of people in Peckham superimposes a parrot on a locket or whatever, and it has a potential to be commodified. And a bunch of people superimposes a parrot or a horse or whatever on a locket, and it has no potential to be commodified. I mean, it's like, it's just not, it's not happening in practice, in institutional practice. There's a really like a geographical, like net art happens in big cities. There's net art in London, there's net art in Berlin, and I miss this discussion around privilege, like what privilege it means that someone's able to commodify it, to address this issue, like even have this potential to engage with a gallery. And it's like, to me, this model that people farm this information, this aesthetics, this content, and then someone turns this into symbolic capital, financial capital. It doesn't correlate with this idea of the network, with this revolutionary potential.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I guess another way of formulating that would be what kind of organisations are adequate to networks in the way that they've kind of been generated over the last, say, 20 years.
Well, so just going back to that point about techno-utopianism in a network is like entirely valid, and the problem is that that network ideology coming out of a sort of Californian ideology and a libertarianism that everyone is equal, and that the internet exists separated from those flows of production that are already existing within capitalism is the great unchallenged part of that. Like a network doesn't necessarily suppose that all nodes are of equal power, and that's really the in pushing a libertarian aspect, like idea of that's how network technology works. Then you remove the actual discussion about ethics. That's the great problem that libertarianism has about the ethics of production.
I mean, to emphasize this point, I think networks are always networks of uneven development, and they develop, I mean, in brackets some parts, but they also underdevelop others. No, I think we can talk of locations and times which are actively being underdeveloped by network influences, and that's also very interesting. It's not connected to progress. It's in many cases connected to quite violent destruction, elimination of resources, and all of that. All of these are also consequences of networks.
Two questions on that row.
In the area of the network, money stopped trickling down. If it ever did, it started trickling up. This is what the network did.
I was thinking about digital art for the past few decades being sort of sidelined or a niche category. And then now that there's been a return to the object with post-internet art, there's more of a mainstream interest in art and technology. So I was wondering why you think this particular moment there's interest. Is it because people have hidden the technological aspects of the work so it's more accessible? Or is it the return to an object which people already understand? In some ways, post-internet seems more like a pre-internet. And I wondered if you could just talk about the specific conditions of contemporary culture and why you think it's more accepted now.
I think I would agree with what you said. I mean, the question you raised, I didn't see actually. Could you just wave so I can? Okay. Thanks for bringing this up. I think it's perfectly valid what you said, because much of so-called media art in the last few decades, as you said, possibly wasn't really accessible to a broader audience because it was too technological, it was too, I don't know, interactive, too whatever. It didn't take on forms that especially the art market was used to. So I think it's definitely an effect of actually becoming or sort of turning more into a format that is already kind of, accepted, I would say.
But I think it's not only that. I mean, of course, there's the art world with this demand for 3D objects and tradable commodities and so on, which 2D items, they do not really fit the bill. But this is one aspect. I think the other one is that basically almost every object now, like every table, every microphone, everything has now also be co-produced online, right? So in a way, the transition from being data to becoming an object is something that is also becoming much more, which happens with more fluidity, if you like. Now, the technological processes have moved on. For example, custom printing something in 3D from data is something which is much more easy to achieve nowadays than it was. I think all of these are parts of this development. It's not only, but to a large extent, also the demand of the art market for, well, extended objects. No.
There's a question there. Long enough to get to it.
I might not formulate this very well, but I'm just wondering, maybe Hugh particularly, something about what happens to democracy in these kind of spaces, and maybe what you said about like Lucky PDF and Ed Fourniel's. Like in a way, there's this kind of idea that in a network you can opt out and be this kind of dissenting or negation. You're saying, but like what becomes of the role for people to be represented in some sense, or like people with maybe less of a voice, which I think institutions have done, but then when they show, say, a prepackaged network, say if the ICA invites Lucky PDF as it did during that remote control exhibition, or if the Serpentine invites Ed Fourniel's to show his, I forget what it was called, Dreamy Awards, what happens to the audience in that case? Because I think there are a lot of people who are a kind of more general audience that institution actually caters for, that are kind of left out of the joke. They're not part of the network that the artists are bringing in, whereas maybe some other exhibition of a slightly older form that isn't so networked could address a more general audience and be kind of relevant to them. Just wondering about the kind of gap and like I guess what you're saying about networks being libertarian is really spot on, because like where is democracy and like does it matter on how, I guess that's kind of vague, but
well, I suppose with regards to, I mean in terms of a wider audience for that work, I mean that is that part of the process of a gallery? That's what I'm saying, an institution now, or are people starting to understand like a creative form of art within their everyday internet existence anyway? Like why does the institution remain a site for for understanding and appreciating and viewing that sort of work? Say take a website like Imager, for example, and you look at the way that the algorithms on Imager promote virality and stuff, and like the way that people produce images and stuff. You got like hundreds of thousands of people daily producing their own meaningful images as a way to give, you're saying, to give information form and to reflect upon themselves and develop their own internet cultures and to develop a discourse and dialogue around images that doesn't need those pre-existing institutions. I mean, I think there's still a room for them to exist within like an art discourse, but like why does the ICA choose Lucky PDF, or why do the Serpentine choose Ed Fourniel's? I think it's because those are the sort of artists who can package that work within a way that the institution can understand clearly enough to be able to see that it's a valid form for it to be able to show, and that's why the other stuff's been left out. When it comes to sort of to democracy within networks, I'm not a techno-utopian, but I do remain optimistic about it as a delegitimizing force, that there's something really positive within that, and the libertarianist aspect is might be the roots of this sort of the ideology of these networks, but actually that's not a precondition for the way it's going to go. It's not predetermined, and you can introduce at a later stage ideas of accountability, which seems to be like the key form for democracy within digital culture. Is about accountability, is about representation, which it's starting to do quite well. One example for that I've been thinking about a lot recently is, for example, you're starting to see sort of collapse of a lot of discourses of third wave feminism happening online within UK, Europe, and America because of sort of Twitter and Tumblr, which is that they are delegitimized by people saying that the way you're talking about your gender experiences don't reflect the gender experiences of working class women and of women of colour, for example. So yeah, I do think that's about there needs to be a conscious project amongst people who use networks to start to understand the ethics of being a participant or a node within a network, to understand that not all nodes are the same. That it's a network, but not a hierarchy. But within a network, these nodes are powerful and have stronger influence, etc., etc. That's an ongoing discussion about accountability and yeah.
There's a further question down there.
Oh, I was just going to kind of comment about the hierarchical structures being challenged by something like Bitcoin, because it doesn't have a central, a central bank or anything. It's just an agreement between individuals. And as a question, I wanted to ask if there were any artists working with the deep web. Do you know? Was that what you're doing anyway? Is it? It seems like it's on the Google level of things, and is it like the deep web is that kind of where like all the information is stored?
Not me personally.
Not really?
I haven't
No.
ventured into the deep web or the dark web or the black
No, I
sea
mean,
of
I've just heard
information or
about
something.
No, actually.
They have the servers on oil rigs, I hear. I was told.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, I just think it's kind of a fascinating thing, and I wondered if artists had looked at it or worked with it. But obviously not. If you knew.
There are plenty of artists working in that field, but for instance, Pirate Bay, a lot of the narratives they come out with is as an art project. So they've shown as Pirate Bay as in numerous exhibitions. So, for instance, that would be one example. There are, I think, one of the probably fundamentally the question that kind of underlies what you're asking is really, art is always about making things visible or drawing attention to the sensual nature of things, whereas one framing. The problem with a lot of the work that's necessary on the internet today is that it's also about encryption, it's about hiding, it's about passing unnoticed and going beneath the surface. And I think the modes of going beneath the surface are hard to make visible, hard to make palpable in an art institution or in a culture of aesthetics that's mainly organised around the visible.
Is that because of the coding? Like, is that a practical issue, or is it an aesthetic and institutional, an audience issue? If that makes sense.
It's mainly because if you want something to be hidden, it's hidden.
It's not.
So
kind of wrecks it, yeah.
But to answer your question, probably the only people that are still in the dark web are art students, because everyone else has gone into even deeper hiding, and all the art students are looking for at these ideas for new works. And also the definition is so is very well, basically the definition of the dark web is not Google searchable or search machine. It cannot be found. Yeah. So it can be very at the surface. So UbiWeb, for example, is technically the dark web. A lot of very, very well-known platforms are technically in the dark web because they are not searchable. But I think that certain areas of the dark web have become like Mallorca now. Everyone is going as a tourist. Yeah.
That sounded intriguing. Thanks.
Sounds great.
Okay, this is the question there.
That actually brings up a really interesting point that I think Hita's touched on a couple of times about actually exiting. This goes in and out of that. Exiting a want of exposure. And the institution historically is what gives us exposure as artists, and now the internet has offered us an opportunity for a different type of exposure that in a lot of ways is maybe more attractive to us because it reaches way further, way faster. And I'd be interested to hear from Harry and Hugh and Hito about what they think about artists and maybe curators and administrators as well, stepping away completely from that type of exposure and maybe turning their back on it in one way or another, what that would look like.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't exclude it's happening, but you wouldn't know about it, right? By definition. No. Yes. Yeah, I see. No. I don't want to answer it specifically, but I see a lot of sort of exit going on, nowadays, from the sort of like going off the grid, but in many different dimensions. Also, like very physically moving off the grid, but also, let's say, in an informational dimension, because this is not where people think that interesting things happen or can happen nowadays, because it's just too controlled, but also it's made calculable. Now it's algorithmized, it's broken down into numbers, it's addressed, it's fixed, it's identifiable. And trying to escape all of this on all sorts of different levels is what I see many people doing nowadays. But as I said, it happens, and there's a sort of seepage and leakage going on. But I think, it would be a sort of paradox if this would be turned back into exposure, no? But, I mean, I think many of the most interesting things going on nowadays use both. I mean, one of my favorite examples Turkish hacker group Red Hack, who performed these unbelievable stunts, like breaking into the Ankara police computer and complaining online later that they have the password 1234. And then they will answer requests from or questions from citizens while they are inside the system. And they are, of course, both, and of course many other groups use the same strategy, of having one a proxy phase, right? Who operate as proxies. Yesterday I was already here. I tried to develop the idea of a politics of the proxy. And I think the proxy is a very interesting idea in that respect, because it allows a certain surface, right? Yet without being nameable, identifiable, trackable, scannable, and so on. And the proxies can be anything, can be a technological device, can be some sort of fictional identity. Can be all sorts of different decoys, or surrogates even, or substitutes. And I think that basically this sort of shifting back and forth between being able to assume a sort of public position, yet remaining non-identifiable, we're probably going to see many more interesting examples.
I think when it was there was like this sort of explosion of Web 2.0 that and people start to really talk about the internet using the metaphor of space, and there was this sort of this idea that everything was now going to move on onto online, and there was like sort of Second Life in 2008 sort of thing, and it was, you know, all these universities and educational institutions pouring vast amounts of money into like developing campuses on Second Life and stuff, you know, like millions and millions of dollars, and you know that never happened because around like 2009, there seemed to me anyway to be this realization, like this collapse of this metaphor of like the internet as a space, and people start to use Web 2.0 to as like an augmentation of their what they would call at the time IRL, but people now refer to as, you know, away from keyboard. Actually, like that digital dualism between you as an online person existing as an avatar and your real life has really dissipated now. And actually, yeah, people use using the internet as a way to develop like both a social and aesthetic subjectivity that exists away from the internet, and that subcultural explosion that's happened because of that you use the internet to find whatever your fetish is. You find your friends, your partners in that fetish, and then you actually do the operations that happen. And it's especially, I think, it was in the art world, happening offline, and then that's the development of, you know, like third spaces and new institutions that are like really under the radar, not really talked about, or happen on a very social level. That's where the conversations and the art and the aesthetic programs are being actually developed, is not actually on the internet.
Everyone's already said everything interesting. So, but I think if the technology is really successful, it's going to become invisible very quickly. And this idea that there isn't, I mean, artworks would have had like maybe kind of two forms, like a gallery space form and then the online form where the image gets photographed and circulated and that sort of thing. And maybe the online-offline duality stems from those sort of being equally important for a certain period of time, and maybe like with computing and networks being sort of more embedded more fully into like the organic world, it'll be more of just kind of it'll be less importance will be placed perhaps on the online circulation or something. But I think that there is like a big difference between looking at your computer screen and walking down the street. So there's for me, I've never understood the complete the desire to unite those two things. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm still confused. Doesn't make any sense. I'm really sorry.
Hello. Sorry, I'm going to be really annoying. I think this is the last question, and it's not so much a question but more a statement. I know that's quite awkward discussions, but I just wanted to briefly maybe point out how the group conversation with all of us, including the audience, has gone in terms of thinking about a separation between net art and post-internet, and just maybe highlight the point that that maybe obviously the problematic is with the term, because it fixes artists who also, like you say, you know, operate in both spaces. So their work might look post-internet, but there is a circulation and there is a use of code as well in their practice that's maybe not so visible to the institution, but is maybe visible to peers more often through social networks and the medium of sociality, like Hugh's mentioned. Sorry, I'm very jet lagged. So the point is that maybe there's not so much a separation, because if we think of net art pieces, net art, the actual websites, Olia Leolina, Angelo Plessis, Raphael Rosendahl being quite a good example of the ideas that you mentioned about immateriality and that being a construct is inherent in net art as well. You know, that these websites are sellable. They are able to be exhibited in institutions. There's a Heath Bunting work at a really good exhibition at the Whitechapel, curated by Helen Kaplinsky. I think it's still on. You know, that some of the conversation has turned into perhaps that there's this cut-off point between net art and between post-internet practices, where what Hito talks about, that the intermedia and the shift between being used by the media or using the media, maybe that's not so much of a distinction, because the idea of the artwork as commodity has always been and still is. And so maybe the final point I'm trying to make in relation to the theme for Lunch Bites is that, yeah, of course, medium still there, still present, and still even present within, well, you mentioned the example of Pirate Bay, you know, within maybe not so art proper cultures and digital technology, you know, if they're able to be exhibited and understood, you know, in a curatorial sense. So that's my statement. So maybe respond to it. It's a bit devil's advocate statement. I don't know.
I've got a quick response. I do think there's something ideological and hidden within the desire to equate the internet and online art with material art, or to say that there isn't a division. And I think there's a kind of aversion to thinking about, like, that point that was made about the actual production of networks and where the power really lies, who has access and who doesn't have access, and the kinds of destruction that are also like the uneven development that you were talking about. So for me, the idea is that you're supposed to think about the internet as a vision of transactions and values sort of freely moving around, and the desire to equate it with that over a more material form is designed to keep it flexible and to keep it adaptable to, like, these changing currents and shifts, in trying to address what's basically just a kind of communicational concept, as in there's no central content to it. All it is an acceleration of the means of communicating. So, yeah, that focus on just those, that, like, to say it again, but that kind of reification of its communicative bit is at the expense of thinking about how it's actually produced. So that's my position on that.
Okay, well, I think that's a good statement in response to end with. Thanks all for coming, and time to get back in the sunlight. Thanks.